This is City Pulse Newsmakers, a weekly look at the issues and the people behind them in Greater Lansing. Brought to you by City Pulse, Lansing's weekly alternative newspaper. And now, here's your host, City Pulse publisher, Burl Schwartz.
Good morning. President-elect Trump has selected as his U.S. Secretary of Education an avid proponent of school choice and vouchers for private schools, including religious ones. She is Betsy DeVos, who is, of course, from West Michigan and prominent in Republican politics. What will that mean to Michigan and the nation? Joining me today are the leaders of two organizations aligned with DeVos's views: Dan Quisenberry of the Michigan Association of Public School Academies, and Gary Nayard of the Great Lakes Education Progress, whose board DeVos has chaired and which is financially supported by the DeVos family. And two critics of DeVos's philosophy, Mitchell Robinson, an associate professor of music education at Michigan State University, and Nate Walker, an organizer and political analyst for Michigan AFT, the Public School Teachers Union. Gentlemen, welcome.
Good morning. Good to be here.
Gary Nayard, I want to start with you in what I'm sure is going to be a robust discussion. MLive quoted you as saying that critics of DeVos's philosophy should be concerned. What should they be concerned about?
Well, what I was quoted as saying is that the critics of Betsy DeVos, who have criticized this parent first, child first agenda for public education, they're outraged that we would upset the apple cart and disrupt the status quo. And what I acknowledged is that outrage is justified. That questioning and concern is certainly justified, because Betsy DeVos has been for nearly 30 years someone who's proposed that your zip code and your condition when you're born shouldn't dictate how far you can go educationally. And she has worked tirelessly to provide additional opportunities and choice and options for parents to seek the educational outcomes that they want for their kids.
Nate and Mitch Robinson, what are your thoughts about his saying that what she is doing is furthering the democratic process of getting education in this country? And Nate?
Well, I think it's interesting because Gary talked about Betsy DeVos as disrupting the status quo, but obviously she's been putting a lot of money and energy in the past 30 years to shaping Michigan's current educational policy. And unfortunately in Michigan, students who are most needy on free or reduced lunch, or students across the state, are underperforming. We're underperforming in Michigan, we're underperforming in our urban areas, we're underperforming in charter schools, we're underperforming in traditional schools. And when you look at the recent policies, especially over the last 10 years, these are ones that have been constructed by Betsy DeVos and have really been intended on underfunding public education. And when you underfund public education, there's consequences to that. And so I think we're concerned about this appointment because we see it being more of the status quo that's happened in Michigan over the last couple of years. So it's interesting to hear Gary frame himself as a champion of disrupting the status quo, where the status quo of Michigan schools are ones that need to be improved, and we're afraid that these policies are going to take root across the country in a more expedient way.
Mitch Robinson?
Well, I think if people are legitimately concerned about the education of all children and creating more educational opportunity for all children, then we should focus on improving and strengthening the schools that 90% of those kids attend. That's not been Mrs. DeVos's agenda. It's been to chip away at the protections for teachers and to destabilize and defund traditional public schools at the expense of charter schools, private schools, and religious schools. So I would just respectfully disagree with that premise.
Dan Quisenberry?
Well, the interesting thing here is we're all agreeing that we need improvement. How do you go about doing that? So the status quo is represented by traditional schools. And how do we make improvement for everybody? You do that with choice. You do that by funding students on an equitable basis. You do that by having real means for identifying how schools are doing. Two out of those three things we've done pretty miserably in Michigan, which is not fund all kids in an equitable way. And we really have a universal absence of a way to look at how schools are actually doing that means anything to even to educators or certainly to parents.
Gary and Dan, why couldn't, instead of trying to commit the nation to a different direction, why couldn't the same goals be accomplished by an all-out commitment to public school education?
Well, I think it's been mischaracterized where we have advocated and where Ms. DeVos has put her energies. I mean, we look at this as a three-legged stool. We want choice, we want quality, and we want accountability. We've done very poorly in Michigan on all three, and the educational performance of our students is lacking. We never said that it was stellar. In fact, we're trailing the nation. We are a top 10 state in how much we invest, and we're a bottom 10 state in how we perform. And this is across the board. So we're not arguing that we haven't been the architect of Michigan's educational landscape. I mean, we're not the ones responsible for the poor outcomes in Detroit that are largely attributed to the fact that 47% of adults in Detroit are functionally illiterate. It shouldn't surprise us that our kids can't read when half the parents can't read. And of those functionally illiterate parents in Detroit, half of them received a diploma from Detroit Public Schools. So we've had a disaster of public education in Detroit for decades. And we're not going to get out of this just by offering choice and choice alone. So we need choice, and we don't have full and comprehensive choice. In Michigan, we're leaving a lot of institutions on the sidelines, not pitching in. We need higher quality, so we need to continue the rigorous standards that we have. We need the third grade reading program that we have championed. And we need greater accountability that not only provides meaningful information to parents about school performance, as Dan said, but we need clear consequences for chronic failure, which we don't have. So we're failing in Michigan on choice, quality, and accountability, and that's across the board, all students, and we are trying to raise the bar for all education.
Define briefly, if you would, what do you mean by choice?
Well, the choice means that all educational options are on the table. We're not trying to eliminate traditional public education. We're trying to provide opportunities for additional choices. So that would be public charter schools, online schools and cyber schools, parochial schools, private schools, magnet schools, theme schools, homeschooling. We believe that all of those options should be available to parents.
Choice also meaning outside of the district you may live in?
Absolutely. I mean, there are 300,000 kids in Michigan, fully 1 out of every 5 children in Michigan, who are not attending the traditional public school within the dotted line. So we have broken the old monopoly somewhat, but 300,000 kids in Michigan who are either attending a charter public school, one of Dan's members, or they're attending a traditional public school outside of the one the government would normally assign them to. Those are people who are benefiting from the policies that we have been promoting. And there wouldn't be theme schools here in Lansing. There wouldn't be a Chinese immersion school in Lansing. There wouldn't be magnet schools if it weren't for the sea change of Proposal A that led us to this idea that the state should fund this child, but the money should follow that child to the school of their choice.
Nate?
Yeah, I'm glad Gary mentioned Detroit, because obviously there's a great need to improve the quality of education across the board for Detroiters. I live there, I work there, I have a 4-year-old who will be attending school there next year, and so I care very much about the city. And I think over this past year or so, there was a broad-based group of folks, bipartisan support within the city about figuring out a way to improve the quality of education for all students in Detroit. Because quite frankly, school choice has been in Detroit for the past 20 years, and part of the original principles of that policy was that not only would it provide parents options, but through school competition, it would improve the quality of education across the sector, and it just hasn't worked. I mean, here we are 20 years later, and there hasn't been broad-scale improvement across the city of Detroit. So it's time to ask, is that the right strategy to improve the quality of education for all kids? And I mean, I certainly think there's a place for choice within the educational landscape of Detroit. I think having options should supplement the traditional school district and some of the options there, but certainly not supplant it. And Gary very publicly last year talked about the need for the eradication of the Detroit public schools, and he and Betsy DeVos dumped millions of dollars to defeating a bill that really would have introduced some of the key principles that he described as being important: accountability across the board, for the district and for charters, and are really starting to figure out a way to fix the landscape for the city. And so
Ms.
again,
Robinson, I
yeah,
see you nodding in agreement. Your thoughts?
Well, I mean, let's talk about choice for a second. The school choice is a false choice. And so when we have all this rhetoric about choice, the analogy would be if you're sitting in your house and your roof is leaking, that you would choose to just move to a new house because there's a lack of resources to be able to fix your own roof. We would be left at the end of that kind of ridiculous charade with an entire community full of leaky houses, and everyone had moved out of town. And that's pretty much what we're seeing in the public education landscape in a lot of our cities. And that's not a solution. If your roof is leaking, you fix the roof. We're not taking care of our public institutions. So the school choice is a false choice, and as Nate said, we have choice in Michigan. What it's done is it's decimate school districts like Lansing and Detroit and Flint. So that's not the choice that we need.
But before we get to you, Dan, people in Lansing, though, would say, I wouldn't be living here anymore if I didn't have school choice. I mean, that's a legitimate concern, isn't it? The city of Lansing would lose population.
Well, the city of Lansing will lose population if they don't take care of their public schools, and that's what we've seen.
Dan?
I think that those are very narrow views of it. Going back to Detroit, and we all carry concern for a city like Detroit. The charter schools in the city, and they're representing more than half of the kids that are residents in the city, are outperforming. Now they need to be improved. Right?
Yeah,
hang on.
Performance is low.
I didn't interrupt you. I'd like to not be interrupted. So 80% of the schools, 80% of the charters are above the average performance in the city of Detroit. It's the exact opposite with the DPS schools. So that performance is important if you can't move out of that city. That's an additional 3 months of education is what those numbers represent. That's really important. And to your point, Burl, the same thing in Detroit. Do you want to keep residents in the city or would they move out? If you look at historic numbers around the city of Detroit, too many people have left because of public school performance or the poor performance of schools. So you want to create an opportunity to create new schools that can perform higher. We're seeing that. They need to do more, but you're really trying to create an environment where people can choose schools. The other thing that would be important to Mitch's point, I didn't see that analogy in what he said. I have two daughters. We all have kids. They're very different. What we can do today is tailor education. My two daughters are very different, would have benefited from having two different types of educational opportunities. You see districts like Lansing here in the city offering lots of opportunities. You can reside here in the city and choose a school that really meets the needs, educational needs of your child by making those choices. That's a very important thing.
And I want to go back, Earl, if I can, just to talk about Nate's comment about the Detroit legislation. We're often accused of many things, but in this legislation, what we opposed was creating a new bureaucracy controlled by the mayor to have czar-like power over all schools in the city with the express purpose, as admitted by Judge Rhodes, of limiting choice and limiting charter enrollment in order to prop up the enrollment in the traditional district to help it survive. That's what we fought against because it was anti-choice. What we fought for and was included in the bill was the uniform and tough application of real consequences for failing schools. So starting next year, any school that has been on the bottom 5% list for 3 consecutive years, whether they're a district school or a charter school, shall be closed by the state. The state has had the power to close schools for 7 years and hasn't even touched one. This legislation that we championed is going to require that chronically failing schools are closed regardless of whether they're charter or district. That's what we fought for, and we're proud of it.
Yeah, so I think a couple of pieces. I guess first in response to Dan, both traditional public and charter schools in Detroit are poor performing. So to say they're outperforming one or another, they're both largely underperforming the state, and there needs to be an improvement.
But the answer to that is not to
let me finish, please. And so I think like here lies our concern with the president-elect's appointment. Is there's been 20 years of policy at this point of choice in Detroit, and it hasn't worked. It hasn't improved the traditional districts, and it hasn't started or maintained a critical mass of high-performing charter schools. So as a policy itself, it's not there. And I think that gets to another sort of key concern we have about the appointment, is that Gary, with all due respect, is a lobbyist for her foundation. We're not talking about necessarily an educational expert or putting policies that are research-based or tested to benefit all children. We're talking about moving forth on an ideology that you outlined in your introduction, one of moving public dollars to private institutions and religious institutions. And so I think we're concerned because we think there needs to be a serious discussion about how we turn around failing schools, and closing them is just not an option, because when you close one failing school, the likelihood is that those students are going to go to another school that may or may not be failing. What we need policies that really dig deep and start to invest in some of the socio and economic things that impact students being ready to learn, investing in universal PK so that all students come to school ready to learn, and we really start to move the needle that way. And the 20 years of our doubling down on the choice system just hasn't worked.
I want to get to the religious part of this.
Well, we've had 100 years of DPS driving right off the cliff of both financial and academic bankruptcy. And we did advocate for the end of DPS the same way that the state took 4 districts that were failing and dissolved 2 of them and turned 2 of them into charter districts. We wanted to know why that wasn't an option for Detroit, why we had to come up with a third plan, which was a $700 million bailout of an institution that had proven through its corrupt history it was unable to teach children and had forfeited its right to educate our children. That's what we worked for. And yes, we've had 20 years of choice in Michigan. And the choice in Detroit, the charter sector in Detroit, those students are twice as proficient as the students in DPS that attend open enrollment schools. Now I'm taking out the selective enrollment schools where you have to have a 4-point to get in, or you have to pass a test. I mean, if I creamed all the top students, my scores would be better too. But open enrollment DPS schools are at single-digit proficiencies. They're the worst performing city in the country and have been for decades. So the charter sector is better, demonstrably better, not good enough, but demonstrably better, and I'm glad those parents have those choices.
I think facts are important, so I just want to respond. Right now, Gary is cherry-picking data and cherry-picking a study to make that claim. And
not a study. I'm talking about MSTEP data.
So it's just really important that if we're going to start to go to the data, that we do it in a way that's...
And Nate, you do a little bit of that yourself. We've known each other for a long time. I have high regard and respect for you, but it's not just being a resident of Detroit in an altruistic way. You work for an organization that is also a political organization, invests lots of money in influencing local elections, state elections, national elections. Do you, as an organization, through the Federation of Teachers, support? One of the things that's missing in Michigan is a system that would really hold schools accountable, even measuring and providing the information. The record shows your organization has not supported those things, has actually worked to take them apart. Would you support a charter-like accountability system? Because we don't just close schools, we actually go in, change boards, bring in different operators, do things that are interventions. Would you support those kinds of things for the traditional public school system as a way to improve things? The record shows that your organization doesn't do that and actually invests political money to oppose those kinds of plans.
Well, yeah, so supporting accountability systems versus supporting your accountability system are different things. And so,
what would you support?
So we're interested in inserting sort of multiple measures that are robust in measuring how schools and how students are performing, with the idea that we can use that data to drive future policy and future programming. We're not for an accountability system that is designed to discipline and punish. And so disciplining and punishing looks like putting schools out, like closing schools on a single test score. Not a good turnaround strategy. There's no data that shows that as a good turnaround strategy.
We should give it a try.
Maybe.
Not done it.
Not
The
at
state has not seriously intervened or closed a single public school.
Not at the expense of the kids in Detroit and Grand Rapids and other places.
It's the adults that are failing these kids, and if you close the school and send these kids to a different environment with a different mindset and real leadership and real teaching and learning.
I think I think the idea that we would just try something for the sake of trying it at the expense of our kids is haphazard and dangerous. And second response,
well, we've shown what 100 years of doing nothing has done.
To say that the adults are failing these kids, we're talking about all of the adults involved in the educational system, which includes you all as well. So,
Dr. Robinson, I want to ask you, do you think overall public schools are failing our kids?
No, and the research indicates that. The vast majority of schools are doing a terrific job. When you control for socioeconomic status, the American schools are right at the top of the charts. The new PISA results came out the other day, and as expected, all the policy analysis across the country, depending on what camp they're in, are jumping all over the numbers. And every year, when we look at the results, what we see is that if you account for socioeconomic status, which is over 70% of the differences in student learning are accounted for by socioeconomic status factors and out-of-school factors, American schools are doing a terrific job. So there's
less than half of our students are proficient in any grade or any subject.
Let him finish
Less
his
than
thought.
half.
I'll give you
I
both
just
an
actually
opportunity.
taught yesterday in one of my classes what the point of evaluation is, and that's what we're talking about here with accountability. There are two purposes for evaluation. One, and the most important one, is to improve instruction. It's for teachers to use the results of evaluation to improve their own practice in the classroom. And the other is accountability for students, for teachers, for schools, and for communities. The approach that I'm hearing you talk about ignores entirely the improvement of instruction and focuses only on the accountability factor, which changes the conversation from one about education to one about being punitive. So that's when we're talking about closing schools. My wife worked in a school that was closed. It tears apart a community. The idea that we would just see if it would work, we don't do that with children. We don't do that with people. You do that with pea pods. You do that with flowers. You don't do that with humans. So
The reality is,
We're saying that
the reality is, Mitch, that's not the only thing that's there. So we agree that there needs to be some
what's not the only
consequence.
thing that's there?
Closure. You're focusing on closure. Listen to the entire thing. The proposals that are being put forward would provide a very robust, instructional, relevant kind of data, meaningful information to all the rest of us, including the professionals in buildings, and do that.
How would it do that?
Ultimately, there's an A through F system that's been proposed. It is actually part of the Detroit legislation. You could look at that, and we would need more time when we have the data to do that. But I'd like to come back to you and say, seriously, are you sure Michigan public schools are as good as they are? As a father, would you allow me to take your two children and place them in any school in this state and you'd be comfortable with that? If not, until the day that that's true, we need to do some things to make sure every parent has the same options that you have to a great education for your children.
I think you're making my point, Dan. School choice is a false choice. It's no more. I don't want parents to have to make the choice that you just gave me about clean drinking water, which we've also failed miserably at in this state. So right now, of course not. Of course I wouldn't put my kid in any school, and I have the financial resources to be able to move to a place to put my kids in terrific schools. I want every parent to have that same kind of choice that I have.
And Gary, a quick comment if you like, and then I want to move on to the religious issue.
Well, I just want to say that less than half of our students are proficient in any grade or any subject in K-8, and our high school juniors are less than 20% of them are college and career ready according to the ACT. We are not succeeding in education. And yes, if we don't count any of the poor kids, we're doing a pretty good job.
Right.
Yes, I agree that if we discount poor kids, our well-to-do kids are getting a pretty good deal.
All right,
of
let's
education.
talk about the religious issue. Tell me why federal funds should go to schools that require students to be involved in religion.
We believe that we believe that every dollar of federal and state money that's meant for students should be attached to the student and go to the school of their choice, public or private.
But
That's
how
a
is that not
philosophical
crossing-
position.
How is that not crossing the line?
Because the U.S. Supreme Court has ruled that public funds going to private or religious institutions does not violate the constitutional separation of church and state. Because that's what the U.S. Supreme Court has said in the San Antonio case. That's the law of the land, despite what people on the street might think every day. And if people think we have an ironclad prohibition on public money in private schools in Michigan, they're ignoring nearly $200 million a year that we spend in Michigan, from pre-K to K-12 to higher ed, on private and religious providers in Michigan today.
Gentlemen, on the religious issue.
Well, I think the religious issue, like I said, is one of a great deal of concern, because I think at the heart of it is, exactly what Gary just shared. Is like, this is a scheme to take public dollars and move them more quickly into private organizations, some religious, some not, to profit adults. And I think what's really troubling about it is it heads us down a two-tiered system of education. Where, I think our fear is that in the next 5 to 10 years, schools will be, segregation will increase within schools, both by socioeconomic status and by race, and that certain types of people will get a certain type of education in this country, and there won't be a collective will to try to figure out strategies to educate those that are most needy, like in Detroit and other places. And so we're very much concerned about the appointment by President-elect Trump, because at the end of the day, public education is one of our great common goods, and for all people. And the minute we start to play with the idea of compulsory education as a common good,
so you don't have a problem per se with the federal funds going into religious schools? It's
no,
a problem in general.
Yeah, we think it's a horrible idea to move forward.
Dan?
An interesting thing, Bill, when this topic comes up, and you've asked the right kind of question, this is certainly something that needs some good civil discourse going forward. But we focus on K-12 in our historic approach to this in this country. We have no trouble with these things in a higher ed environment, and yet our higher ed institutions in this country and in this state are world-renowned. We have no trouble with it on a pre-K basis. Why then is it different in K-8? Again, we represent public schools. Our charter schools are not allowed to be private, are not allowed to be religious. They follow all the requirements of public education. But it's an interesting concept. If we are going to get to a place where I heard Mitch talking about, where we're going to have an opportunity to, even for educators, we forget that educators want to improve the system and do things differently. How do you do that if you don't allow some different approaches to that, including involving a very healthy
let's not
private
forget
education?
Let's not forget that the appointment of Betsy DeVos is by a president-elect who has made inflammatory comments about certain religions and discriminated against certain religions. So when we talk about this point, we must remember who made this appointment.
We've always had
and for what
school
reasons.
choice in this country for the rich, and no one bothers with that. Mitch and I both had the means to pick up and move to a school. We just think poor people need school choice as well, and if Nate could organize the nuns, he might change his position on privates.
Word. I want to thank all of you for being here today. An interesting discussion, and we will see you next week. Have a great cold weekend.